The years from 1900 to 1930 were the most turbulent in Ireland's history. World War I, the Easter Rising of 1916, the War of Independence and the following Civil War brought about trauma and hardship to a huge number of its citizens. Stories of events leading up to the rebellion and its aftermath are well recorded and documented. Some are not generally known, but there are many telling of events across all counties in the country. During the War of Independence, we had the introduction of the Black and Tans, the random checkpoints and raids on suspect houses, all of which brought about unease, anger and uncertainty throughout the island of Ireland. Every town, city and district have a tale to tell, and the story here refers to a well-known Dublin landmark on the Crumlin Road, the Halfway House.
Walking into this landmark pub, I was immediately struck that this building is steeped in history and has seen many changes over the last few centuries. There are numerous photo memorabilia of the Rising and references to this pub on the walls. The item which caught my eye on entering the pub was a sketch of the ruins of this iconic building. History tells us that this pub was raided and set on fire deliberately. Why was it raided? And who set it on fire in 1921? Let us go back in time and set the scene for this momentous occasion.
But first, let's take a look at the ancient road system in Ireland, which were known as Slee. Some of these fanned out from Dublin City and were the main arteries to rural Ireland. The Slee Assail went through Slane in Meath and west to Longford and then on to Cruachan in Roscommon. The Slee Midlucra went north to Drogheda and Dundalk in Louth, passing west of Belfast and ending in Derry. The Slee Coulon ran from Stony Batter in northwest Dublin, crossing the River Liffey via the ford of Hurdles, then went south through the old district of Coulon in Wexford to Waterford City. The Slee Moor, also known as the Great Highway, joined the Escarriada west of Dublin. It then more or less followed the Escarriada to Galway. Finally, the Slee Dála ran from the centre of Dublin through Crumlin, Tala and on through Kildare, Laois, Tipperary to Limerick. In Viking times, Dublin was divided into three areas. Dublin was inhabited by native Irish. Difflin was inhabited by Vikings. Aughclea was the location of the ford on the River Liffey and the monastic settlements. At that time, St. Patrick's Cathedral was known as St. Patrick's in Insula, as it was located on an island surrounded by the River Poddle. Beyond the city walls, the area was mostly open countryside, with some small rural settlements centred on the main routes out of the city. In the year 1215, the lands of Drimnagh and Tirrenior were granted by King John to a Norman knight, Hugo de Berneval, who had come over with Strongbow. These lands were given to him in return for his family's help in the Crusades and the invasion of Ireland. De Berneval, Anglicised to Barnwall, selected a site beside the Crooked Glen, the original Crumlin. That gives its name to the townland of Crumlin, and there he built his castle. This Crooked Glen is better known today as Lansdowne Valley, through which the river Camac makes its way to join the River Liffey before flowing into Dublin Bay. The Bluebell stream runs through the moat around Drimnagh Castle. The lands around Drimnagh at this time were rising and falling hills and vast forests stretching into the Dublin mountains. All through the 13th, 14th and 15th century, the area around the castle was sparsely populated, and a document shows that only around 11 people lived in the area during the 18th century. Drimnagh had seen its fair share of raids and attacks by the O'Toole clans through the years, and there is record of 2 of the barn walls of Drimnagh being killed in a skirmish near Crumlin. How many more battles and raids were undocumented, we can only guess at. After these tumultuous times, Drimnagh in the early 19th century saw the arrival of industries like the paper mill at Lansdowne Valley and other enterprises. Small inns and lodges for travellers on their way to Tallaght or further afield were built at the Red Cow and the Halfway House. Buildings of note in the area around the 19th century were the Drimnagh Lodge, the Halfway House, Drimnagh Castle. After the 19th century, we see more and more expansion out towards the Drimnagh area, but it was the 20th century where we see housing estates and industrial estates springing up around Drimnagh. The Halfway House pub is located on the ancient route Sliegadala to Limerick in the southwest. This was a busy route, with farmers bringing their goods to Dublin. It was an important stopping off point and meeting place for people travelling into and out of the city. It was a well-known bona fide house up until the 1960s. Up to the 1900s, all pubs closed early. However, a bona fide house on the outskirts of the city utilised a legal loophole dating back to early coaching days that allowed a genuine bona fide traveller more than 3 miles from his place of residence to drink alcohol outside normal hours. At the pub, there was a fork in the road. Sliegadala to the left, now known as Walkinstown Road, and a county road, which later became known as the Long Mile Road to the right. The Halfway House was named as it was roughly halfway between Dublin and Tallaght. It became an important stopping point for people and farmers from rich pastures of Kildare travelling to and from the city. The old stone trough, which stood outside the door for many years, provided the horses and animals with much needed refreshment while their owners partook of a different refreshment inside. The premises also sold food and agricultural requirements. The exact date of the earliest inn on the site is not known, but a public house has been in existence for well over 2 centuries. In the 1860s, the Corcoran family, well-known Dublin spirit dealers, operated the premises as a spirit and grocery shop. In the early 1900s, the business was taken over by the Conway family, who operated here until late 1920s. The Yates family then owned the pub until 1988, and that is when the current owner, Jerry O'Malley, took over. Near the top of the Walkinstown Road, part of the old Sliegadala, can be seen an old milestone belonging to the time when this was the main road to Blessington. It is of granite and triangular in cross-section, with inscriptions on 2 faces. On one face is DUB2, and on the other, BTON 15. This milestone is 2 English miles from Dublin and 15 from Blessington. This makes a total of 17 miles, which is close to what was then believed to be the distance from Dublin to Blessington. In the early 1800s, this part of Dublin was completely agricultural, with very few houses in the locality. On the present-day Walkinstown Road stood Wilkinstown House, and on the Long Mile Road, Drimnagh Castle. In essence, the Halfway House was an important staging post on the road into Dublin from Kildare and the southwest. In the 1900s, Wilkinstown House was a distinctive country home owned by Alderman Michael Flanagan's family. A son of Michael Flanagan, William, known as the Bird Flanagan, a well-known Dublin character and an infamous practical joker, lived there. Michael Flanagan was a Dublin City Councillor, an alderman, a Justice of the Peace, a not insignificant landowner and local employer, occasionally termed an agriculturalist, a farmer and a hugely successful market gardener. From quite modest beginnings at his father's holdings in Greenhills, near Timon in Tallaght, County Dublin, he established a thriving business over the years, supplying fresh vegetables for the then rapidly expanding city of Dublin. The area he ultimately farmed from 1866 to 1925 stretched around southwest County Dublin, and at its height, about 1914, the massive Flanagan estate was estimated to cover at least 500 acres and possibly up to 1,000 acres of prime market garden land. He lived to see a number of the fourth generation of his family, outliving all his siblings, his wife, and most of his children. The bird Flanagan could only be described as a bit of a character in the history of Dublin. The bird was said to live off the wealth and name of his father, but created a name for himself through his fun and games in the city. In one particularly legendary instance, the bird was said to approach King Edward at the Curragh while he was strolling with his castle worthies during an important racing event. It was said that Flanagan succeeded in getting a fiver from the King of England, which was no small achievement. The bird famously rode his horse through the doors of the Gresham Hotel, O'Connell Street, Dublin, and asked for a drink. "It's after hours, sir," replied a porter. "It's not for me, you fool, it's for the horse." The story goes that once he got into the bar, he jumped his horse over the bar counter and then jumped back again. This was for a bet. One day, the bird noticed a young policeman on duty in Thomas Street, and wishing to have some fun, he purchased a ham in a nearby shop. He requested the shop assistant to hang the ham outside the shop. As soon as he drew the attention of the policeman, he grabbed the ham and ran away with it, chased by the policeman. After running some distance, he came to a halt, and when the policeman accused him of stealing the ham, he told him it was his ham. The policeman took the bird back to the shop to have him charged. The policeman was furious when the shop assistant confirmed that the bird had bought the ham. Walkinstown House, together with its yards and outhouses, was eventually acquired by Fergal Quinn of Super Quinn fame, and a supermarket was built on the site. After many years of trading as Super Quinn, it was taken over by the SuperValue Group. Some of the old boundary walls of the former property are still evident. One in particular fronts the supermarket car park, albeit lowered in height. In the 18th century, the coach from Dublin to Rathcoole followed the Sliagdala to the halfway house and continued as a winding road to Rathcoole. After 1814, a section of this old winding Dublin-Rathcoole route was replaced in part by the following straight roads, now known as the Long Mile Road, the Drimnagh Road and the Crumlin Road. Folklore has it that a horse owned by the bird Flanagan and ridden by his groom George Duffin was involved in a horse race along the new road from the halfway house to present-day Naas Road. The distance agreed for the race was 1 mile. However, after dispute at the end of the race, it had to be rerun until Flanagan's horse eventually won. The locals refer to the race as a long mile, and the road is known ever since as the Long Mile Road. Further along the Naas Road, besides Rathcoole, is located Baldonnel Aerodrome. This had been originally developed in the context of a major expansion of pilot training in the latter stages of Great Britain's air effort during World War I. At that time, it was a small grass airfield of about 230 acres with a wide range of residential, regimental and technical buildings. Early in 1917, it was decided to expand the Royal Flying Corps into 106 service squadrons and 97 reserve squadrons. Baldonnel was the location of No. 23 Training Depot Station. The Air Council in November 1917 obtained possession of 42 acres of the lands of the future aerodrome at Baldonnel. Between May 1919 and February 1920, the Air Council obtained 5 other parcels of land to make up the original airfield. Construction work commenced at Baldonnel in late 1917. It was not completed at the end of the war in November 1918. The main distinguishing feature was the line of aeroplane hangars, each 170 feet by 100 feet, laid out in 3 conjoined pairs with a single repair shed standing alone in the line. The vast bulk of the building material was transported from Dublin by rail to Baldonnel. This was achieved by the construction and operation of a special 24-inch gauge line from the nearest mainline station at Lucan South on the Great Southern and Western Railway Company line. Building materials and the workforce were transported from Kingsbridge Euston Station on the main line by special train. The building materials were transferred to the narrow gauge train, which was equipped with wagons and bogies suited to the carrying of sand, gravel, cement, timber and hardware. Some 25 bogies were adapted with back-to-back seating for the movement of up to 200 men at a time to and from the site. An evening return train ran at about 5:30 p.m, with another at about 7:30 p.m. for those on overtime. Baldonnel became operational on the 1st of September 1918 with the transfer of 31 Training Squadron from Whiten in England. Due to delays, the facilities were not completed fully at this time. The maximum training activity at Baldonnel from September to December 1918 had been relatively short. In February 1919, training finally ceased in Baldonnel. With its demobilisation, Baldonnel was designated to be the headquarters for all RAF in Ireland. In May 1918, 2 operational squadrons had been sent to Ireland. The Lord Lieutenant Field Marshal Viscount French thought that air patrolling with machine guns ought to put the fear of God into those playful Sinn Féiners. During the guerrilla warfare type of campaign of 1920 and 1921, the main operational function of the 100 Squadron flights at Baldonnel was to cooperate with the British Army by assisting with internal security duties. Offensive air patrols, despite the stated policy, was never flown. In 1921, maintenance workers were brought from Dublin by car or lorry to Baldonnel in the morning and brought back to Dublin in the evening. After the signing of the treaty in December 1921, the Baldonnel Aerodrome was taken over from the British forces on the 3rd of May 1922. Following the 1916 Easter Rising, 1,800 Irish prisoners, including Michael Collins, were imprisoned in an abandoned distillery and makeshift huts at the Frungach in Merionethshire, Wales. Frungach has a unique place in the history of these islands, but was largely overlooked until recently. Conditions at Frungach were poor. The buildings were bitterly cold and infested with rats. The camp proved an excellent opportunity for networking and training for the Republicans. It became a fertile breeding ground for the spreading of the revolutionary gospel of the Irish rebels, with inspired organisers such as Collins giving impromptu lessons in guerrilla tactics. Later, the camp became known as the University of Revolution. Up until then, the Republicans had been in small clandestine groups across Ireland. Released in December 1916, the prisoners returned to Ireland and helped form the Irish Republican Army. IRA groups were formed throughout Ireland from prisoners released from Frungach. After the Rising in 1916, the British Irish Constabulary, RIC, continued to maintain law and order in Ireland. The RIC was a largely domestic police force with strong community ties. The RIC stations were staffed by local Irishmen who were familiar with the people in the local community. Following the closure of Frungach and the return of the internees to Ireland, active units of the IRA were established throughout Ireland. An uneasy peace prevailed at the time throughout the country. On the 21st of January 1919, 160 pounds of gelignite to be used for stone blasting at Solo Beg Quarry was loaded onto a cart outside the military barracks in Tipperary town. 2 RIC policemen, Constables MacDonnell and O'Connell, and 2 council workmen were accompanying the cart on its way to Solo Head Beg Quarry. Outside the quarry, the constables were ambushed and killed by the 3rd Tipperary Brigade of the IRA. This was the start of a campaign against the RIC waged by the Republican movement. Coincidentally, Dáil Éireann met for the first time on the very same date. As more attacks followed, the police began resigning and retiring in their thousands. The RIC abandoned their barracks due to the IRA attacking them. This was a deliberate policy by local IRA units throughout 1919. By attacking the smaller barracks and thereby forcing the RIC out meant that large areas were under the control of the IRA, and they could move about more freely and thus forcing the RIC into one big barracks in the local town. In March and April 1920, the IRA burned all the barracks that had been evacuated. Very symbolic, as it showed the government were losing control. This led to a much smaller police force consolidating their ranks in heavily fortified police stations in the larger rural towns and cities. Faced with the need for more, better prepared men wearing police uniforms, the government augmented RIC numbers and capabilities by recruiting Great War veterans from throughout the UK. They were paid 10 shillings per day. From early 1920 through to the truce in July 1921, 13,732 new police recruits were added to the nearly 10,000 members of the old RIC to maintain a constabulary strength that at the end reached about 14,500. The new recruits stood out in RIC ranks as they were issued with military khaki uniforms and were referred to as the Black and Tans. The Black and Tans were sworn as constables to reinforce county stations, and their experience with weapons and tactics gave the RIC a tougher edge. The IRA campaign led to another recruitment initiative in July 1920 of the Auxiliary Division, or Auxies. The auxiliaries were former military officers with a first-class record who were paid £1 per day. They wore distinctive tam o' shanter caps and operated in counterinsurgency units independent of other RIC formations. The auxiliaries were a separate category of police and are particularly remembered for their brutality and the militarisation of the police. The auxiliaries' ferocity was reputed to be fuelled by heavy drinking. Folk memory holds that the British administration was not very concerned about the backgrounds of Black and Tan recruits, as long as they had military experience. The Black and Tans and auxiliaries were overwhelmingly British. In the years after the Easter Rising, the halfway house became a regular meeting place for Republicans. There was a high level of Republican activity in 1920. Many military actions took place in and around Dublin, including raids on barracks and several prison escapes and rescues. The Black and Tans issued the following proclamation in 1920. Republicans beware. If in the vicinity a policeman is shot, 5 of the leading Sinn Féiners will be shot. This is not coercion, it is an eye for an eye. We are not drunk, maddened savages, as we are described in the Dublin rags. We are not out for loot. We are inoffensive to women. We are as humane as other Christians, but we have restrained ourselves too long. Are we to lie down while our comrades are being shot in cold blood by the corner boys and ragamuffins of Ireland? We say never, and all the inquiries in the world will not stop our desire for revenge. Stop the shooting of police, or we will lay low every house that smells of Sinn Féin. Remember Balbriggan. In the same year, the attacks ordered by Michael Collins resulted in the Bloody Sunday reprisals, and other incidents around the city continued into 1921. In our area, the halfway house also suffered. In his witness statement recorded in 1951 of events in the Crumlin area, Joseph McGuinness of Evergreen Cottage, New Road, Clondalkin, County Dublin, a member of the local active service unit of the IRA, stated,
"In the early summer of 1921, it was usual for the British to provide transport for civilian employees at the aerodrome to take them to and from their homes in the city each day. For this purpose, 2 touring cars were provided. Our local service unit of the IRA decided to intercept this convoy and take over and destroy the mechanical transport. So, without any difficulty, on an evening in May, we held up 3 cars at the halfway house, compelled the civilians to alight, and made the drivers drive us with our cars to Glencree. We left them there at a spot where they could be collected by the Wicklow volunteers. As a result of this capture of the cars, the British decided to provide an armed escort in future.
The Irish Independent of the 26th of April 1921 published the following article on a roadside scene near Dublin where RAF tenders were seized. 3 Royal Air Force motors, 2 Crossley tenders and a touring car were held up and taken by armed men near Crumlin last evening. The 3 cars were bringing the staff of the Works Building Department of Baldonnel Aerodrome to Dublin when the hold-up took place near the halfway house Crumlin. When the first Crossley car, which left the aerodrome in advance of the others, found the road blocked with a bread van and a farmer's cart. The car slowed up in an attempt to pass, and immediately 7 or 8 armed men appeared and ordered out the occupants, taking possession of the car. The second Crossley and the private car were similarly commandeered. All the staff, numbering about 25, were lined along the road with their hands up. The raiders at first were going to allow the staff to proceed to Dublin in one of the Crossleys, but changed their minds. The drivers of the 2 Crossleys were ordered into their seats, and one of the raiders took the steering wheel of the touring car. Dividing themselves between the 3 cars, the raiders then drove away, leaving the staff lined up on the road. On the 5th of May 1921, an ambush known as the Halfway House Ambush was carried out by an active service unit of IRA. Witness statements were recorded by 3 members of this active service unit in 1951. They were Colonel Padraig O'Connor, 9 Mangerton Road, Drimnagh, Dublin; George Nolan, 206 Bangor Road, Kimmage, Dublin; and Joseph McGuinness, Evergreen Cottage, New Road, Clondalkin, County Dublin. Their recollections of the ambush were:
For some time during the month of May, we closely observed the movements of the British escort from Baldonnel. We knew the civilians employed would be conveyed each evening in a Leyland lorry which contained an armed escort. For a few evenings we observed the movements of this lorry and learned that when it deposited the civilian employees in the city, it returned to Baldonnel almost immediately, conveying only armed soldiers. The section commander, Michael Sweeney, decided that it should be ambushed and intercepted. The position taken up for the ambush was at the halfway house, better known as Conway's, on the Crumlin Road, leading onto the main Naas Road. On the evening on which it was arranged to have the attack, 2 sections took up position on both sides of the road at the halfway house. 2 men, Michael Sweeney and Jimmy McGuinness, armed with grenades, would stand at the entrance to a public lavatory. 7 men were placed behind a ditch on the same side as the public house, and 3 men on the opposite side behind a low wall on a private driveway to Drimnagh Castle. After about a quarter of an hour's wait, we saw the lorry coming towards us. In fact, we heard it before it came into view, as the British Tommies were singing loudly. The instructions were that the grenades were to be thrown first and that the remainder of the section would then open fire simultaneously. Having taken up our positions, the lorry came into view and, as it came abreast of the outdoor toilet, Jimmy McGuinness and Sweeney both fired 2 grenades at it. Jimmy McGuinness's grenade put it in the centre of the lorry, but Sweeney's grenade, which was a large homemade one, hit the top of the lorry and it fell back on the road, exploding. Jimmy McGuinness was very quick to see what was happening. He grabbed Sweeney almost instantly and threw him back into the toilet. Sweeney was badly wounded in the abdomen. Were it not for the McGuinness quick action, Sweeney would have been blown to bits. While this was happening, the remainder of the sections opened fire simultaneously on the lorry. The party were evidently taken by surprise, and when they came under fire, the driver was wounded in the arm and the lorry slowed down and zigzagged for about a mile up the road, where it was brought to a standstill. At the time, we did not know the result of our ambush, but we were told later that the casualties on the part of the British were very heavy.
Following the halfway house ambush, the Black and Tans immediately mounted roadblocks in the area. In his witness statement, Richard Mullally, St Camillus Tala, County Dublin, recorded:
In 1917, with a few others, I formed a company of the Irish volunteers in the Tala area. The total strength was about 14 or 15. Our activities included raids for arms, cutting the telephone wires to Baldon Lairdrome, and felling trees across the road. There is one incident that stands out in my career. I was coming home on my bicycle from Dublin one evening early in May 1921, and on the Crumlin road near the halfway house there is a crossroad here, and the British soldiers were searching everyone that passed. I was within 200 yards of the crossroads when I saw the soldiers. I turned back and they opened fire on me. I heard 4 or 5 bullets whiz past me, and I felt one strike my bicycle. But I got away through Crumlin village and across Willington Lane onto the Terranure Blessington Road at Spawa. When I got some distance up the road, I got off my bicycle and I noticed a dent in the mudguard about 3 inches from the carrier. I had a parcel tied on the carrier which contained 1 pound of gelignite. If the bullet had struck the gelignite, I don't think that I'd be here to tell this tale.
On Saturday 7th of May 1921, the headline splashed across the Irish Times read, "Incendiarism in County Dublin, well-known inn destroyed." The Halfway House, a well-known inn situated at Crumlin, County Dublin, was raided yesterday morning about 2 o'clock by a party of armed men with blackened faces and set on fire. The premises at the time were occupied by Mrs. Kathleen Conway, the owner, her sister Mrs. Elizabeth Yates, her 2 nephews Richard and Michael Yates, and Mary Kennedy, the maid. An entrance was forced through the door of the business premises, and after the occupants were ordered to leave, the shop was fired, the incendiaries leaving soon afterwards. Though rain was falling heavily at the time, the flames spread quickly and soon involved the whole premises. The fire had been in progress more than 2 hours before Dublin Fire Brigade was summoned, and when it arrived, in charge of Captain Myers, soon after 5, considerable destruction had been wrought. The firemen's operations were much handicapped owing to an inadequate supply of water, and it was not until near 9 o'clock that with the aid of buckets and hand pumps they succeeded in extinguishing the fire. On several occasions recently, shots have been fired at Crown forces in the vicinity of the public house, and on Wednesday night a party of military was ambushed when passing the Halfway House. Only the walls of the premises remain standing. The damage is stated to be over £5,000. The work of the brigade prevented the flames extending to adjoining outhouses. It is claimed that many locals took souvenirs from the rubble, including one man from the Ballymount area who used the tiled from the wreckage to lay a new garden path to his house. While there are no details available of the rebuilding of the Halfway House, an article in the Irish Times indicated that it was trading as a public house in 1923. The article in the Irish Times of the 26th of February 1923 noted that St James's Gate Harriers held an invitational cross-country run. The St James's Gate Harriers have proved a very active body since its formation in November last, and as of the event, which it inaugurated on Saturday, will probably become an annual affair. It is to be hoped that in future it will be possible to hold on a date earlier in the season. After a run of between 4 and 5 miles across the country, the men lined up at the Halfway House on the Crumlin Road for a race of 1.5 miles to the finish. From the late 1920s, the pub was owned and run by the Yates family until 1988, when they decided to sell up. The current owner, Jerry O'Malley, paid what was then a record price at auction for a Dublin pub. Centuries after it first opened its doors to the public, the Halfway House is continuing to serve its customers in the finest traditions of Dublin public houses.